Continuing with our PowerPoint presentations, in this PowerPoint presentation, we will go over some things again. Notice there are some redundancy built into these. We'll introduce Jesus and gender. We will come back to this. Again, some reference to Kyriarchy, what we mean by that, how it's applied to historical Jesus studies. We'll again touch on methods that we're using, a reference to polyphasic experience as a part of religious experience, honor shame, and again, meals as religious social rituals in the ancient Mediterranean world. So here's an interesting quote from an ancient Greek source, obviously written by a man. The woman says that my husband's honor is all the adornment I need. Again, I think it represents an androcentric, patriarchal, hierarchical, valued world where women are simply the adornment of men. They exist for the pleasure of men, for the advancement of men, and a patriarchal or hierarchical system. Again, let's return to Luke 7:36 through 50. This story about Jesus visiting a Pharisee's home by the name of Simon. Notice that again in the home, the event is around a meal or a table. Jesus shows up. He's not greeted by Simon with the usual greeting, which would either be the household leader or one of his servants came and would wash your feet, give you some ointment for your hair, and then escort you to the triclinium or the room where the meal was. Jesus seems to show up, and Simon doesn't give him the courtesy of this usual greeting. But what does happen, uninvited, a woman referred to as a sinner, most with her hair down, probably a reference to a prostitute, a known prostitute in the city, shows up again uninvited, goes up to Jesus, who is reclining at table. Now, they didn't have chairs, they reclined on their side. So she comes up to Jesus' feet and starts weeping and fussing over Jesus, washing his feet with her tears and hair, then taking some expensive ointment and anointing, symbolic here, the anointed one being anointed by this sinner, this woman, starts anointing his hair. Now, Simon and the other Pharisees were obviously appalled. I picture them huddling in a corner, thinking, oh my God, this impure woman has come in and is not only approached him and has defiled our table, our meal, but he doesn't know who she is. You get the feeling that Simon and everybody in town knew who she was, and one wonders how they knew who she was, but nonetheless, it's scandalous. Luke is portraying an event that would have caused consternation, people to gasp in the society. And Jesus allows this all to happen. He allows her to approach him. He allows her to touch him and to fuss all over him as if he were somebody special. And then notice that Jesus addresses Simon and basically says, well, let her alone. Those who have their sins forgiven, if they have a lot of sins, will respond with a great deal of love, and that's what she's doing, and a great deal of faith. And then he goes on to say her sins are forgiven, and this too would be somewhat blasphemous. So Simon and the Pharisees, who probably invited Jesus in just to check him out to see if he was going to be part of the solution, ends up being, in their minds anyway, part of the problem. If everyone acted like this Jesus of Nazareth, God could never send his Messiah. So there's an irony and a dramatic scene. Now, a question for us, is there any historical relevance behind this episode in Luke? In other words, is it authentic Jesus of Nazareth? And so we would begin, based upon our criteria of authenticity, to try to explain why or why not it might be. Now, again, I would have you think about this on your own and practice this. And by the way, this text may show up on your midterm, and you would be asked to do a similar accounting of it. So, for example, is it in the plausibility of the ancient Near East that a woman would not be accepted at a meal and would be seen as scandalous? Well, that's, very plausible. Is it possible also in terms of coherence? Is this something that coheres or is like what we know about Jesus of Nazareth? Whereas we'll see Jesus was very open to the inclusion of women and sinners. So it very much aligns itself. As far as multiple attestations, that doesn't help us out very much. But again, remember, Luke appears to have some of his own special material that he's using. So what's the social significance? Having a meal with sinners at it. And what's the gender significance of a story like this? Well, it would certainly instruct Luke's congregation and early Christians that, again, Jesus included sinners as symbolic at a meal, as symbolic of what the kingdom of God was like, the God of Israel embracing or including, gathering everyone, regardless of their status as male or female, or as someone who might be considered an untouchable or a sinner. So what would it have to do with power? Certainly this type of social action, including women as equals, including sinners in the company of those who thought of themselves as righteous before God, it would certainly tend to level the playing field. So in other words, while men would be losing some power here, a gesture like this, a practice like this would elevate women. So they would men would be powering down, and women would be given some avenues to increase their status or power, if you will. What's the theological significance for Luke's communities? Well, again, I think the idea for Luke is that the God of Israel, as demonstrated through the historical Jesus, is a radically inclusive God, gathering all peoples together in a joyous, festive banquet, if you will. And social memory. This story was passed on through early Christianity to the point that it gets to a written document in Luke's gospel. Why was this story passed on? It's doubtful that Luke just invented it. So again, we may speculate that since this was a common practice of Jesus, excuse me, going into a home around a table and including people that were ostracized or marginalized, this seems to have been passed on as part of the Jesus tradition, and here used for Luke's own community. So basically, or generally, this is how we would approach a text like this. So we're attempting to read the New Testament, in this case, the New Testament Gospels, in context or context. There's a historical, social, cultural context. that we're talking about. In other words, a time, a place, who's receiving this gospel or who's listening to these stories, the language that is used, including the metaphors, certain customs, the politics, the economics, and the religious practices. All of this has to be taken in consideration of reconstructing or putting something in its original context. Also, there is a literary context. I mean, the gospel writers themselves, how they're portraying Jesus. And so we want to look at the text. What comes before this story in Luke's gospel? What comes after? How did he arrange it? Can we learn anything there? The rhetorical situation can we imagine that this story was used to address a specific issue in Luke's community or Luke's congregation, for example, or other gospel congregations? Is there something that would help us there? Remember, the rhetorical situation is the author using this Jesus material to address an issue, to make a point, a theological point, a social point for the congregation. So again, we tend to want to ask these type of questions when we're reading the text. And again, this requires methods and models to be able to do this. Generally, the historical critical method means deconstructing. Well, deconstructing what? Well, deconstructing anachronistic interpretations. In other words, not simply assuming that later customs that are a part of our culture and familiar to us were actually relevant or a part of that culture. Deconstructing later interpretations or doctrines that later Christians will build up around Jesus. We need to make sure that we're not looking through later lenses that have already constructed Jesus and maybe in a way that is not aligned with the historical Jesus. So later doctrines, these anachronistic readings, we want to remove or deconstruct, putting it in its context. Also helpful are social scientific models. Looking at the economic models from the time, economic anthropology helps us with that. We will return to that and look at the models that were available and to determine which model Jesus seemed to favor in terms of economic practices in his community. Cultural anthropology helps us understand all sorts of practices, especially honor and shame, and so we'll do that. Political theories of power, this too is something that can help us in deconstructing and reconstructing the power systems that were in vogue during the time of Jesus to see if it can help us understand what's going on or perhaps what type of power he's reacting against. And I think we've mentioned Kyriarchy already and the Roman occupation and Roman power. To do a sociological analysis, in other words, looking at how society was formed, group identity, what did it mean to belong to a group, and how groups related to one another. Rhetorical criticism we've mentioned. The authors, in other words, are not just recording a historical event. The authors are using something from the Jesus material or Jesus tradition to address situations in their own communities. This is what keeps a tradition alive, by reusing material to make it address new situations. Does that mean there's no history? No, it simply means that simply recording accurate history was not the purpose of these authors. Feminist biblical criticism is essentially important. We have to hear the voice and the voices of women in the text. They are there. They're important. And again, to understand that power power systems, Kyriarchy, tended to disadvantage women. So again, a feminist perspective, a feminist critique is vitally important when doing New Testament or historical Jesus studies these days. Conflict theory, the idea that most social systems are responding to one another in terms of competition for power, for wealth, for goods and resources, rather than cooperation. This course, myself, tend to follow conflict theory when looking at the development of early Christianity. Post-colonial biblical criticism, in other words, the early Jesus movement, and for some time, these are people who are not in control of society. These are not the people with power. These are the ones being oppressed. This is history from below. So now that will change over time, but early Christianity is under the oppressive rule of Rome, and they are colonized by Roman power. So this post-colonial biblical criticism helps us understand what that looks like. And we'll look at these terms: hybridity, mimicry, and ambivalence. So there's a little bit of both taking on some of the values of the dominant culture and at the same time resisting the dominant culture. So we'll return to that as well. There's also post-colonial feminist biblical criticism that we shall use that is available for us as well, and social scientific criticism. Again, we shall have an opportunity to look. So these are just a quick look and a summary of some of the methods and models that are available for us. And we decide amongst these different varieties of understanding the text, getting back to reconstruct the original situation, how these can help us. Here's a view of the ancient Mediterranean world, the ancient Roman Empire. Notice at the far right, or the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, is Palestine and the area that Jesus was operating on. Christianity will spread rapidly to Italy, that boot-shaped geographical figure in the center of the screen, and there will be a vital presence of Christianity in the actual capital of the Roman Empire, that is the city of Rome. We remember that the culture of the time, religious rituals were central, not just for religious belief or the afterlife. Religious rituals were central to the economic, political, and social life of all of these cultures in the ancient Mediterranean world. Animal sacrifice represented a major central feature of religious expression and practice of rituals in the ancient world. So these were taken seriously. And many of the metaphors, the reference to blood, the blood of animals, again, carries on even today through religions like Christianity, but it represents a metaphoric or symbolic way of suggesting what these rituals accomplished in the world of the humans connected with the divine world or the God of Israel. The emperor. We have to recognize that the emperor was both a political and religious figure. Every aspect of political life also had a religious dimension. It would be futile or ridiculous in that time not to rely on religious power in political rule. And again, remember, religion is embedded in political institutions. So the emperor is not only a political figure, he's also characterized as a priestly figure as well. And this is throughout the ancient Near East and ancient Mediterranean world. It's, again, a polyphasic culture, not a monophasic. In other words, people at that time were much more open to religious experiences, dreams, religious rituals. It was not just a cultural thing to them. It was something that connected them with reality and could transform reality. So we need to be able to appreciate that about that culture and not our more monophasic or explaining such things away, giving them little or no importance, because it prevents us from being able to understand the culture or read some of these stories and text and appreciate what they would have meant in that time. We do need to, as modern Western people, be prepared to look at ourselves in a critical light. Excuse me. For example, the Harvard medical doctor, anthropologist, author Kleinman speaks of the West deficiency. What is our deficiency? Well, when it comes to understanding religious experiences, or another term used in cultural anthropology and religious studies, altered states of consciousness, abbreviated ASC. So why do we have a deficiency when it comes to understanding in a polyphasic culture such experiences? Well, according to two biblical scholars and who use cultural anthropology, Malina and Pilch, and I quote them, only the modern secular West seems to have blocked individuals' access to these otherwise pan-human dimensions of self. So what again is the Western problem? Well, it's related to the beginning of modern science in the 17th century, because according to them, the West began to look at the world and human experience in a way that fractured the bio-psycho-spiritual unity of human consciousness that had existed until then. And there's a good tattoo, bio-psycho-spiritual unity. In other words, something happened that prior to this time, humans did not separate the human character by separating bio-psycho-spiritual events. And that has caused, according to people like Kleinman, Malina and Pilch and others, created a difficulty for we in the West to get back and understand people for whom there was no fractured experience. So again, according to Kleinman, our modern culture has developed an acquired consciousness whereby we disassociate self and look at self objectively. Now, what he means by that, if I may continue with Kleinman, Western culture socializes individuals to develop a meta-self. In other words, a critical observer who monitors and comments on experience, our own experience. The meta-self does not allow, according to Kleinman, the total absorption in lived experience, which is the very essence of highly focused, altered states of consciousness. The meta-self stands in the way of unreflected, unmediated experience, which now becomes distance. So in other words, we know that people continue to have mystical thoughts, mystical experiences, feelings, even powerful paranormal altered states of consciousness today. Westerners tend to if they have such an experience, or if they hear of such an experience, stand back, disassociate themselves from it, and say, it was nothing. It means nothing. Or it's in some sense delusional. So again, by distancing ourselves from our own experience, we also distance ourselves from those for whom in the first century felt that these were important and people should pay attention to them. Continuing with the Kleinman, so if we recognize that objectivity is simply socially tutored subjectivity, we might be more empathetic with persons of other cultures who report perceptions we find incredible just because they are socially dysfunctional for us. So again, this is something that we need to be aware of from our own perspective. A part of an anachronistic understanding, it again makes it difficult for us to plug into the first century culture that we're trying to get back to appreciate what was going on in the terms of those who were experiencing it. Not to say that it was true or false, but simply to be able to understand what was central and important to people who lived in that culture. So again, hopefully this is a healthy caveat and reminder for us. Now, honor-shame, already mentioned. Honor-shame represents an incredibly central and important value in the socialization of people who grew up in the ancient Mediterranean world. There was ascribed honor. In other words, you were born with a certain amount of status or honor into your family. And there was acquired honor. In other words, you could take honor from others, especially in public. So males constantly who were responsible for protecting honor had to be on the guard that in a public setting, in other words, in the eyes of your community, you did not do anything or say anything that would shame you or your family, especially your father. And if you did, and if it would be viewed by the community as having been shamed and therefore losing honor, and since honor was viewed to be in a limited source, this carried again some social significance in that culture. Usually, it was only males that would protect honor. Women were simply not to do a shameful thing. But you did not want to be shamed or lose honor in a public situation. This is what helps create a term used in social science, agonistic society. In other words, a society where there is conflict and between competing males especially, and taken from the word agony, it creates tension, hostility, to always be on the guard. Every potential male you meet in public you're not related to is also your potential enemy or a threat to your honor, your family's honor. It creates a rather hostile environment. We still have honor and shame today, power and Kyriarchy today that we can relate to, but it's, in terms of bullying and some other social phenomena, but it's not exactly the same in the first century. And again, males were socialized in the ancient world to dominate other males, especially in public, and to dominate other females, especially sexually. That was too a part of this first century culture. Jesus of Nazareth interestingly taught, if someone slaps you on the cheek, a clear challenge to honor, turn the other cheek. In other words, in that culture, you were, as a young male, raised or socialized that if someone for example, slapped you on the cheek, a physical challenge, your proper response would be to do what? Well, to slap them back. And then it's in the other person's court, and if that male wanted to escalate, he could hit you with a closed fist or grab a club or something. And violence usually did spiral in the ancient world, not just between individuals, but between nations and rival groups. But Jesus says if someone slaps you on the cheek, obviously happening in public between two males, his advice was turn the other cheek. In other words, that would be considered in that culture a shameful thing. If it got back to you, your home, to your uncles or to your father, that you were slapped publicly and that you turned the other cheek and just walked away, you would be under great scrutiny and criticism at home for something like that. So what is Jesus doing by this? Well, scholars would say that he's attempting to re-socialize his patriarchal or kyriarchal culture. In other words, stop playing the honor-shame game. It leads to nothing but hostility, agonistic societies, and often escalating violence. The kingdom of God or heaven was not to be based upon this type of honor-shame system. It was not based upon patriarchy, protecting male power, slash kyriarchy. So Jesus of Nazareth is understood as challenging the ancient Mediterranean systems or pyramids of power, a descending scale of males at the top, all the way down to the lowest classes and status of people, where you always had a male above you as your patron. And somebody would always be above you all the way up to the emperor. This would obviously include aggression and violence that legitimated and sustained power or hierarchy. This is how you preserve this power. So from a public slap in the face to crucifixion, this involved the honor and shames standard. Jesus is crucified for daring to challenge Roman power. So it plays in at every level in that society. So remember that religion and politics in the ancient Mediterranean world, religion is embedded in political institutions. It's there, it's used, it's taken seriously, but it's not separated. It's not just about the afterlife. It's about every dimension of social life. And beginning especially with the ancient household or oikos, and where the father ruled. And the father was to rule his household and keep it in order, reflecting the great order of the cosmos, according to some ancient Greeks. All marriages, all divorces were kyriarchal or patriarchal. In other words, all marriages and divorces benefited men while disadvantaging women. All meals were religious meals with powerful social ramifications. You had to be careful with whom you ate and associated with, because these meals carried with them ongoing social ramifications. We would think of it more in terms of written contracts. Most meals were highly exclusive. Women were most generally excluded. There are some exceptions, but usually this is in Rome, and the women are already people of substance, of power, perhaps entrepreneurs. But generally speaking, women were considered less important, with less power, and even in some cases, the actual property of men. Meals excluded the poor, slaves, those considered impure, sinners, and tax collectors. By the way, here are some ancient remains in Israel of an oikos or a household in Haifa. Here's a characterization of a typical the homes were typically 4 bedrooms, peasant homes, all the way from Palestine, all the way down into Egypt. And that looks like he's mowing his roof, but it's a thatched roof. And notice animals could wander into the home as well. Here's a type of typical 4-bed or 4-room ancient oikos or home represented in this picture that we see before.